Okay, now that we've already talked about our materials, we're going to start talking about changing our textures within SolidWorks Visualize. With this, you can see that I've got my cup of water and I set it to have a heavy rippled appearance. So I've got heavily rippled water here, and it is way too ripply for something that's going to exist in a measuring cup. So I'm going to want to change this. So I'm going to go ahead and do is I could attempt to change it by looking in my appearances, and I go into where I find water any second now. There we go, I've got water. And oh, there's one that is less ripply. And I can zoom in and it looks a little bit less ripply, but that is way too detailed. Again, for a glass of water, it looks like it is a small ocean in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my heavy rippled, and I can actually modify that within my texture tab. So within this, if I click on there or I click on my ... here, either of these is going to bring me to my texture selections where I can see all of the different textures that exist for me to use in this case. And I'm perfectly happy with the one I have, so I'm not going to actually modify that. And then I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to this piece for tiles. So tiles are basically those images, how we want those images distributed. If I have more of those images, it's going to be a smaller pattern. It's going to be more of those patterns showing in a single surface. If I have a smaller number, it's going to stretch it out. I'm going to have one or more of those patterns, or one or less of those patterns representing my entire surface. In this case, I want it to go down because if I go up, I get way too much going on there. So I can go ahead and go back and I can modify that. So we'll go down significantly lower, so 0.01, and we see that, oh, this is now blown way out of proportion, and then 0.1 somewhere in between. We actually want it to be pretty small because while it looks kind of weird in this view, if I go to my detailed view and give it a second to initialize, it looks much more like the water we might see moving slightly within a cup. And if I stop moving it around, it might actually render. There we go. We see that it looks pretty reasonable for water at this point. Go back to our basic view, and let's talk about a different way we can approach this. Before we do that, I'm actually going to talk about depth while we're here. Depth is something I normally don't mess with very much, but basically this is saying how deep those cuts in our pattern are. So as you can see, when I set my depth here to 0, I just have a flat face here. It is a perfect reflection as if there were no ripples. I've said that my texture, difference between the top of my texture and the bottom of my texture is 0. There is no reason for there to be some weird reflections going on there. If I set it to be a little bit less, you see that it's acting a bit like a flat surface, but you can see that there's some texture to it. Go back to my 1, this is my original. You're seeing a decent amount of refraction. Again, this is using the base view, and then I set it up higher and those refractions kind of take over. So 1 is normally pretty okay for what we want. Okay, next thing we can do is we can get into texture mapping. So first piece that I was working with was within texture. I'm now talking about texture mapping right next to it here. And this is where I get into my mode. And in this case, my mode is currently UV. This is more or less just saying this is the settings that SolidWorks had that it imported from SolidWorks as far as what the scales of different textures are, what the scales of the part are. And I'm not terribly happy with that, so I'm going to go ahead and set it how I want it. So there are a few different options here. I'm really going to focus, because most of them are going to fall under radial or planar, tend to work best for me. Spherical and box are both great. Cylindrical, honestly, could work, very specific to get it to be what you're actually looking for. But I can go ahead and set it to planar, and it already scaled it because we can automatically scale in 2 ways. We can scale to the world hole, or we can fit to part, or we can manipulate it ourselves, which is what I'm doing here. When I click that manipulate, I'm going to go back a second so you can see it. When I click that manipulate, this guy showed up right here. And this guy is what's going to allow me to change it. So clicking on this yellow guy in the middle that I just put a dot on, that guy is going to allow me to change the overall scale manually of this. Clicking on this red guy is going to let me change it along an axis so I can stretch the texture. Clicking on any of these planes, so I'm going to put the dot on the green plane, is going to let me move it, free drag it anywhere on that plane that I wish. And then clicking on any of these rotation pieces, clicking on the side, lets me rotate my pattern as I see fit. So I'm going to kind of go through a couple of those right here. Clicking on the green guy, moving it way off into the corner, as we saw a little bit earlier. I'm then going to go ahead and hit the red guy, and you can see that it's stretching. I actually have a better demonstration of this when we talk about one of our other commands here. Going the yellow guy and scaling it manually. There we go, a little bit more obvious what's going on. And then I can actually make it so those things aren't visible. This is the piece that allows me to get in and edit those things, even without having that open, even without going through textures. Okay, skipping forward a little bit, I switched it to radial at this point. And we'll go back right to where I switched to radial. And what this is doing is the pattern is no longer in a straight line. It is centered at a point. So I had my point set right here. And basically the pattern is extending out from this. And you can see that I have a radial pattern where it is stretching out from one point. And not the best for my water, but great for if I've got a circular surface that I need some etching around in a circular pattern. It'll do a great job for me. I can do my fit to part, and I can fit to world as well. And then manipulating it, I cannot click on my planes to move it, but I can still click on the arrows, which only move it along the plane. So let me get back to the manipulate. So in this case, I'm clicking on this red arrow right here that's now pink instead of the plane, because that will let me move it only in this direction. I can't move it either of those directions. It won't allow it because it can only move in the direction of the arrow there. But that's how I can change where my center point is on these radial pieces. Don't feel like you can't change it just because you default with the plane and it doesn't move. As you can see, the center is changing. Now, getting back to this is where I you can really tell in this one by pulling on this little red dot and stretching it. You can see that these guys are really stretched out along this line versus not much stretching is happening in this direction. Radial just makes that a little bit easier to visualize, but it is possible there as well. So that is basics of how texturing works. So I'm going to skip through because I played with this a bunch, set it back to normal, and then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back and I'm going to mess with my part because I want to go back and look at the cup. We're going to change the cup to a metal material. So to do that, I want to only see the cup. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this guy up. I'm going to update it. So there is this update option up top. If you change something in your part and you want it to update the overall model, it'll reset it completely, which is a little bit unfortunate for us. But it lets us pull everything into our current model. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the appearances that I had set up and put them back on my piece so that everything is how I left off, other than I am missing the water in my cup at this point. And we're going to go into our appearance library, and we are going to grab a new appearance that we're going to look at is we're going to look at brush brass. We're going to pull it in and show this overall piece. And you can see that we have our lines of brushing on this piece. They are clearly way too big and not quite in the pattern that we might want them to be. So texture mapping is currently box. We can set it to UV, and that looks nice just because it is so small. But if we zoom in, it's still not quite what we're after. So the issue we're going to come into here is ideally we would have something radial on these circular surfaces. So we've got a brushing around and around on those circular surfaces. And then when we get to our, I'm going to pause this. When we get to our handle, this is where we want it linear. And the issue is that these two things are set up as the same thing as far as appearance is concerned. So the easiest way to fix this is by going back in SolidWorks. But with this, I switch it to the radial. We see that it doesn't look quite right because the center is not where we want the center to be. So you can see the radial is following here, meaning the center is somewhere over here-ish. We ideally want the center to be in the center of the bottom of the cup because that's where this guy would be turned out from. So we can go through, we can physically pull this guy back over and get it recentered on the center of our cup. And that is actually the center despite what the view looks like. And we're seeing that all of those lines are now rotating around there, which is great for us. We can go into our texture, we can change the tiling so that it's a little bit less obvious, less brushed. And all of that looks great for the cup. The problem is that's not necessarily what I want for the handle, because making it a little bit clearer to see from further out, we can see the handle has got these big swooping lines in this direction, when it makes a lot more sense that we probably took a mill to this and it created a bunch of lines in this direction to make it. So what we're going to do is we can go in and we can physically change it on this piece, and we created a planar piece, as you can see right here. And what I'm doing is I'm moving this just over here so that I can manipulate a little bit more, and I rotate the angle in such a way that is going along the handle so that my brush lines are just like so. And that is what I want the handle to look like. The problem is changing the handle like that has also changed the inside of my cup. I no longer have that nice curved surface on the inside of my cup all the way. I mean, it normally does like these edges. In this case, it didn't even do that, but you can see that the lines are going straight through instead of the curves that we just set up. We can't choose both currently. So with this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to SolidWorks. I am going to edit my appearance. I'm going to add a new appearance, and I am going to go ahead and add a appearance to some of the inside surfaces. I go ahead and select my appearance first here. Since it doesn't really matter, I grab this guy, and what I'm going to do for my appearance is I'm going to select all of my curved surfaces on one set. Sometimes you want to change this a little bit more individually, and that is fine as well. But I'm going to go ahead and select all of these in one go. And you can really use anything for this. Sometimes this texture piece is nice because it's very obvious if you forgot to do something. But now I have two different materials, one material for my handle, one material for my cup. I can update, I can go back in. It's going to take a second to update, and it keeps switching screens on me. But now I can leave the linear one on the cup, change that to be a little bit better. I'm going to go ahead and copy it to start so that I got two of them. And I can pull this other one and put it on my inside of my cup. And what's happening here is it automatically jumped to cylindrical, which is nice, but I'm actually going to look for a radial. Cylindrical is not a bad choice for this. Really, you can figure these out by playing with them a little bit yourselves. But, well, I left it as cylindrical apparently. But we can go through and we can have this guy set up, and we can set up our handle now individually, because one of them is right here, one of them is right here. We've got two different appearances going on, and each of them for a different area. There we go. I switched to radio. And we have one set up, centered nicely, and we can go back and that's just showing that it is centered nicely. We can go back and we can edit the second one, because this is clearly too large currently. And I think I just want to fit to part. Nope, I'm manipulating the tile so that it is, there we go, fit to part. So that is there, and we can zoom in and we can see that we have two pieces going on here. We have our brush lines in this direction for the cup. We have our brush lines in this direction for the handle. And that's where you might want to actually break up something that all of this is the same material, but it makes a little bit more sense to have it physically separate. So that is our brass cup right there. Hopefully that's helpful. Take care.